I'm Dr. Gad Saad, author, professor, and advocate for freedom of thought. As someone devoted to freedom, personal responsibility, meritocracy, and free enterprise, I am honored to join Northwood University. Northwood isn't just a university, it's a launch pad for future leaders. Here, students gain the skills to thrive in a global free market economy. It's a place where innovation flourishes, ideas are exchanged freely, and diverse perspectives are celebrated. Guided by the Northwood idea, this institution teaches students to think critically, lead ethically, and act boldly in business and in life. It's higher education rooted in freedom and driven by purpose. At Northwood, free thinkers become catalysts and courageous leaders find their spark. If you're ready to unlock your potential and make a lasting impact, Northwood University is where it begins. Discover America's free enterprise university. Visit northwood.edu.
Hi, everybody. This is God Side for the Sad Truth. Today I have another wonderful guest, Josh Hammer. How are you doing, sir?
It's really great to meet you. I'm a longtime fan. I really appreciate joining the program. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. So you are by training a lawyer. I think you're not that we get into the details of a CV, but your law degrees from University of Chicago. I maybe I'll ask you later if you took a course with Professor Barack Obama. Uh, but you're also a columnist, I think, opinion leader, opinion editor at large at Newsweek, and you have your inaugural book that just came out. Let me just get the title right. I don't have the physical copy, otherwise I would put it up. I think it's probably at my office. Israel and Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Anything else we need to add to the bio? Otherwise, let's drill down into your book.
I think that works just fine. So there's too many fine details to unpack there. So let's stick to the good stuff here. I think you got it right.
Let me tell you how and I'm sorry to say that I only discovered your work and your voice recently. We often go on rides, the entire family, my children, my wife, and I. In this case, we were going to get some Peruvian chicken, which we often do. It keeps us thin and trim. And I said, well, what do you want to listen to? I said, well, why don't you put Dave Rubin on? We all know him, we love him. And then here comes Josh Hammer, and I said, oh, you know what? I think I need to hook up with this guy. He seems like he's got his head straight. So thank you, Dave Rubin, for introducing me to the brilliant Josh Hammer. So let's get into the book. Give us a big synopsis, and then we can drill down.
All right. So first of all, that's great to hear. Dave's a very good friend. We're both part of the whole South Florida cabal. So God, you're welcome anytime to join us down here on a vacation, or we of course would love to break bread with you. So the book is called Israel and Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. The key part for understanding the book is that the word Israel is serving something of a dual function. It is referring to the capital S state of Israel, of course. On the other hand, it is very much referring to the nation of Israel, the children of Israel, in other words, the Jewish people. And the book God was written really in response, not necessarily to October 7th itself, but in response to the reaction to October 7th. Like many people, my jaw just dropped to the floor at what I saw out there. The world had a clear moment there where it saw this stark dichotomy between the 7th century Islamist medieval death cult and the free and flourishing state of Israel. And the world was deeply confused, morally and strategically, as to who it should side with, this death cult or the children of Israel there. And I decided that as a younger right of center voice here in America, especially given a lot of confusion, sadly, even among certain right of center pockets on this issue, not just the left of center, it was time for someone to basically write the case, not just for for the state of Israel and for U.S.-Israel relations, but really just to defend the Jewish people, to defend Judaism, to defend the original people of the book, the original monotheistic religion, off of which Christianity, of course, ultimately was an offshoot. And ultimately, God, the book argues that Western civilization began at Mount Sinai. I argue that Mount Sinai, which was God's revelation to Moses and the children of Israel, that was the initial moment that we can trace the origins of what today we call Western civilization. I essentially argue the Western civilization is largely synonymous with the Bible and the biblical inheritance. So that would mean Judaism and Christianity there. And the book covers a lot of foreign policy, U.S. Israel relations. It's all in there. I talk about anti Semitism, anti Zionism, all of that there. But the book fundamentally is a post October 7th defense, frankly, of the Jewish people, of Judaism, and of our joint biblical inheritance, frankly.
Would this have been a book that was simmering in your brain prior to October 7th? Because as I was reading your bio, you used to sort of come from a more reform background. You've
Mm-hmm.
become somewhat more orthodox these days. So is it simply the natural progression of you sort of getting more in touch with your Judaism that led you to write this book? Or is it really October 7th happened? You saw the insane reaction that people had to this tragic story, and you said, you know what? Let me open up that laptop and start writing.
Well, you're very astute, and kudos to you for doing the background. So I have become more observant, more religious in my Judaism over the past 5, 10 years or so. And that definitely is part of it. So my personal narrative is in this book. I very much weave my personal story throughout the book. There's not like one chapter that's dedicated to me. I kind of just intersperse it throughout. I tried to do so in a seamless way possible. But the second to last chapter of the book is called the Maccabean imperative, and that is kind of my call to the Jewish people. It's really the only chapter of the book that is written specifically for the Jews. Most of the book is written primarily, I would say, for a Christian audience, but that second to last chapter is really written for the Jews. My personal journey does come out there. But no, I decided to write this book purely after October 7th. I'll actually be even a little more honest with you. I was planning on writing a totally different book. In fact, I had my book proposal for a totally different concept basically ready to go, and it was fairly close to hit the submit button, but I was kind of vacillating, prevaricating a little bit there, and my agent basically said to me and said, you know, Josh, you're so invested in this issue of the Jewish state, the Jewish people, the United States, the foreign policy, all these things there. Why don't you change topics? And I kind of paused on it. I mulled it over for a weekend, and I basically said, you know what? You're right. And so that really was how it worked there. But it came really organically, as I think anyone who has read the book or at least read part of it can tell. It really just flow quite naturally for a very simple reason, Gab, which is that is from the heart. It really is from the heart because that is where the personal journey, the personal narrative comes in there. My wife was born in Israel. It's very personal to me. It's very personal to me. It's very personal to a lot of Jews, obviously. It's very personal to a lot of inheritors and defenders of the West more generally. So it really did flow from the heart, and I'm really happy that I chose this as my first book.
Got you. Now, whenever I give lectures on, Jew hatred and so on, I usually break it up or the sources of Jew hatred into three categories. Of course, the academic left, Jews are white colonizers, noble Palestinians, they're people of color who just want peace. And then you've got, the neo-Nazis, sort of, the whites won't replace us. And then you've got the Islamic source of Jew hatred, which, of course, I'm intimately familiar with, given my background from the Middle East, growing up in Lebanon and so on. Uh, so first, is there a in this taxonomy of Jew hatred, is there a fourth group that I'm forgetting, or did I cover pretty much the whole swath of Jew haters?
That is a generally accepted three-headed dichotomy. I think when Barry Weiss wrote her book in 2019 or 2018, whenever she wrote that book, it was a similar three-headed monster, you might say. I guess I will add this slight twist. I generally accept that premise. I guess I will add a very slight twist, which is there are different forms of left of center and right of center anti-Semitism, right? So left of center anti-Semitism can basically break down into just straight up anti-Zionism. If you basically made the argument that the Jewish state is uniquely responsible for all the world's ills, at some point that does become necessarily ipso facto anti-Semitism. Then you have this kind of woke oppressor oppressed DEI post Frankfurt School 1960s era form of anti-Semitism. And then on the right as well, I think that there are different strands of anti-Semitism. So on the one hand, you have this newly reascendant form, and it really breaks my heart as someone who is so passionate about Jewish-Christian relations. I've been adamant about this my entire life. One of my best friends from childhood was a religious Christian. Some of my best friends today are devout Christians. I cherish Jewish-Christian relations, so it breaks my heart that there are some people these days who are saying a lot of anti-Semitic things in the name of their Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And look, we can get into that if you want to there, but part of that is really troubling there. These are the people that are basically tweeting out Christ is king,
Right.
not as an affirmation of their own faith, which, you know, God bless, that's good for you. I have no objection to that, but they're doing it as a taunt to the Jewish people. So that is, I think, one strand of right of center anti-Semitism. Then there's a different strand that is not coming from a nominally or purportedly Christian starting point. It's coming from a pagan starting point there. This is kind of where the Tate brothers come in, Andrew and Tristan Tate. A lot of these online pseudonymous accounts, people like Bronze Age perverts that are basically trying to resuscitate a lot of old pagan nostrums. And when you start from a place of paganism, that's necessarily opposed to the Bible. I mean, paganism and the Bible, pick one. You can't have both. They are necessarily at odds with one another, as anyone who's read the Ten Commandments would be very familiar with there. So that's part of it as well. But the two strands, unfortunately, on the right do go hand in hand to an extent there, and really was trying to solve that maybe above all issues, not solve, but try to ameliorate the damage of above all concerns. That really is probably what motivated me to write this book.
One of the things that frustrates me the most in this, if I can say, in this space, are the self-hating Jews, right? The ones that I
Oh
call
yeah.
the wood cricket Jews, right? The Gabor Mate and his son, the Glenn Greenwald, right? Who's a gay man, but who decide gay Jewish man who decides that in choosing whether to support the Gazan treatment of gay Jews or the Tel Aviv treatment of gay Jews, well, you just have to side with Gaza. There's just much more flourishing trajectory for you there. And so those guys really upset me because at least in some maybe perverse way, you can respect the Islamic guy who hates Jews and he's committed to his cause. But when you are Jewish and you are so parasitized, to use the term that I've become well known for, that even upsets me more than, Ahmad writing to me some Jew hating stuff. Do you share in that animus? And what is your explanation for the unique manifestation of the self hating Jew?
Fantastic question. I share your absolute dripping antipathy, disdain, disgust. I have personally debated numerous of these Jews over the years. I did debate with Peter Beinart on Israel-Palestinian
Yes.
conflict. I debated him in 2021. It was during COVID, so it was a Zoom only debate. But Gad, I think you'll appreciate this. My opening statement in literally the first 60 seconds of this debate, I told Peter Beinart that he has the exact same stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as Hamas and neo-Nazis themselves, and he seemed pretty rattled. So I think my strategy in that debate worked, which was basically just to come out swinging and then rattle him out the gate. Similarly, I had debate against Dave Smith at Princeton University just 2 months ago. This was on February 11th. This debate just happened. Dave Smith has obviously been in the headlines over the past week or so because of his most recent Joe Rogan appearance with Douglas Murray. Dave Smith is a transparently self-hating Jew. I mean, very similar to a Glenn Greenwald. I mean, these people just totally disgust me. But the key thing to remember, Gad, is that these people have existed for almost as long as the Jewish people
Right.
have existed. There's at least there are various ways to unpack that, but one traditional rabbinic teaching here is that during the Exodus from Egypt, which we are celebrating now during Passover, but during the Exodus from Egypt, there were some non-Jews who basically followed along with the Jews. In Jewish thought, we call that the Erev Rav. And the notion is that it was those people, the Erev Rav, who actually committed the original sin of the golden calf right after Revelation at Mount Sinai. And to this day, when it comes to the self-hating Jews, we think that many of them are descendant from the Erev Rav, who literally followed Moses and the Israelites out of Egypt. So I say all that because this problem's been with us for a very, very, very long time. We all know the stories of the literal capos during World War II, the ones who were collaborationists with the Nazis and their occupiers. I'm not necessarily going to say that everyone who supports a two-state solution, for instance, is a capo. I try to be a little more precise with my words of choice. But yeah, some people are genuinely just outright self-hating Jews. Their Jewish identity means nothing to them, nothing at best. I mean, at worst, they actually just despise the fact that they are Jewish. But it's a problem that has existed for a very long time. It possibly, quite likely, will never go away. On the good side though, we're still here. We're still here, and we're still kicking butt. So that is why I take solace in the fact that the self-haters are still with us, because ultimately they're not going to prevail.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Dave Smith because this was an issue that I wanted to address because I mean, very, very few things surprise me at this stage in that, I've seen it all. I've been in this, battle of ideas in various instantiations of the battle of ideas for many decades. And so you would think that I'm completely inoculated against the possibility of any surprise, but then I was surprised, and let me tell you how. So I posted a maybe 10-minute clip a few days ago. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, where actually I mentioned earlier that I discovered you while riding with the rest of the family. So we were heading last week to Ottawa, where I was one of the plenary speakers at a Canada Strong and Free Network event, which is mainly libertarian and conservative Canadians. And, we have a Canadian federal election coming up. And so I was excited to be the plenary speaker. And on our way to Ottawa, I said, okay, well, what should we listen to? So, Douglas Murray is someone that I respect greatly. I love what he does. He's coming on my show next week. He's already been on my show. His book just dropped. So I said, okay, well, why don't we listen to his thing with Dave Smith? I didn't know, I wasn't very familiar with Dave Smith. And so the first 45 minutes or so was very much not related to the content of the debate, but rather, why do we have people who know nothing about this speaking? That was Douglas's point. And I said very, very gently, I can be quite punchy and direct. And here it wasn't at all intended to be that. It was, I love Douglas Murray. I think he's fantastic. God bless Douglas Murray. I would probably stylistically not have used any appeals to authority or slash credentialism or you've never been to Gaza, so how can none of those persuasion strategies I would have used. Dave Smith's positions are idiotic because they are idiotic, not because he is a comedian. And that was it. That was the start and end of any stylistic
Yeah.
critique I had. But otherwise, I'm the biggest fan of Douglas. If you saw the number of Jews who wrote me unbelievably nasty stuff because number one, I dared criticize a champion of the Jews, in this case Douglas Murray. The day before, they thought I was the biggest champion of the Jews since the time of King David, but I suddenly became Himmler because I had the audacity of criticizing just one stylistic thing that he did. Number two, I became also Himmler, double Himmler, because I wasn't disassociating myself publicly from Joe Rogan, who's a good friend of mine, whose show I've been on many times. Because how could I be friends with someone who grants airspace to these degenerates, meaning the anti-Israel guys? And again, I think both of those arguments that the Jews are making against me, frankly, are very hurtful and unfair. But they demonstrate that even our fellow Jews, in my view, could be as parasitized by a lack of understanding of freedom of speech and freedom to associate as I might say about anybody else. Do you agree with me? And of course, you don't have to agree with me. What are your thoughts on my reaction to the animus I received from Jews?
Okay, so a few things to unpack there. First of all, Douglas is a friend, like it seems like he is for you. I actually interviewed Douglas in Tel Aviv about a year ago. I've known him for years now. He is obviously a great champion, not just of the Jewish people, but of Western civilization as a whole. And I wish his new book nothing but the best. I think his book and my book are in some ways very similar, in some ways a little bit different there. So I'm very happy that both of them are out. I probably would not necessarily have done stylistically what Douglas did in terms of this appeal to authority. I think the better tactic to take with someone like Dave Smith, and query whether or not I did this myself when I debated Dave at Princeton University, is basically just to say that he doesn't know what the heck he's talking about.
Exactly.
And that doesn't necessarily matter whether you have a degree from this place or you visited there. You just don't know what you're talking about. So I'll give an example. When I was debating Dave at Princeton in February, he was trying to make the argument that there has been a genocide in Gaza. Now, you mentioned at the outset, Gad, that I'm a lawyer, so I know some definitions about what genocide is and what it is not. So I start talking about international law. I'm citing to statistics of combatant to civilian death ratios with citations to John Spencer at the West Point, the leading authority on
Oh, he's
urban
coming on my
warfare.
show next week also.
He's amazing.
Yeah.
You're gonna love him. He's absolutely fantastic. So anyway, so I'm rattling off law and statistics there, and Dave Smith's response to me is like, but look at it. It's a bunch of rubble, and I'm like, that's not an argument. That's literally not an argument there. I mean, at another point in my debate with Smith, I got him to admit that he could not. I kid you not. He was unable to choose who he trusted more as a human being between Bibi Netanyahu on the one hand and Osama bin Laden on the other hand there. He professed agnosticism. He was unsure who he thought was more trustworthy. So to me, that's probably the better tactic to take with Dave Smith. But I mean, Douglas is obviously brilliant there. I will say in Douglas's defense, I think he was able to show to Joe Rogan's audience, and I've never met Joe Rogan. I'd love to go on his show, but I've never met the guy. But I do think that it's fair to point out that his guests have veered in a more Israel skeptical direction there. So I thought that Douglas certainly was able to land some blows in that respect, and I think frankly it took a lot of courage actually for Douglas to do that, going into Joe Rogan's actual podcast studio and to do that. So I'm very grateful certainly for that. But as far as you personally, I mean, you're obviously a champion of the Jewish people. I mean, no one could possibly look at you and your work and conclude otherwise there. So, I mean, you're the last person really who should be getting any kind of criticism there. Look, ultimately, if we want to refine our arguments, even among our friends there, I mean, we're in the battle of ideas. That's essentially what you and I both do for a living, and many of our other friends in the space there. And it's important that you come with the facts and then you come with the arguments and you come with the tactics there. So if you think that Douglas maybe didn't do something perfectly and could do something a little bit better next time, that's totally fair game to point that out, I think.
And in a sense, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree with you, the courage. I mean, the personal courage. I mean, it takes more courage to criticize Islam than to walk to Joe Rogan's podcast and criticize him. But in a sense, that also takes courage, to your point, which is you're walking into this host's platform and you're kind of wagging the finger at him. And so, in a sense, I respected him for that. But then why can't you then grant the same respect for me? I mean, not you, I mean, but whomever's criticizing me, but grant me the same respect for saying, look, I love 99.999% of everything that Douglas Murray says, but in my view, maybe that stylistic thing could have been done better. And that's it. We move on. By the way, there are people who write to me who completely support everything I do. They'll say, oh, it maybe you shouldn't use the term castrato when somebody upsets you, right? Because if you've been insulting me for a long time, then I can sort of take, put up my sleeves and I will use spicy language with you, always kind of with a twinkle in my eye. The fact that Josh might write to me and say, you know what, I wouldn't use the term castrato doesn't suddenly mean that I think that because you said that, Josh, you're now Himmler. And so it amazes me that people aren't able to navigate through these very, very simple issues. But I guess that's
Right.
what happens when you're feverish. Uh, all right, let's keep going. You want to talk at all about some of your legal stuff, originalism, and so on? I very
Well,
quickly.
let me just briefly mention one thing about kind of the Dave Smith kind of Douglas Murray follow up as well here. So one thing that I just generally don't think is effective in these style of debates is to go ad hominem, is to try to attack the credentials or lack thereof of the individual. Now you can show the person is just an ignoramus or a fool, doesn't know what they're talking about. That's what I was trying to do with this back and forth about genocide there. But generally speaking, so Dave Smith, as you and I were just discussing, he fits the definition of a self-hating Jew. He is an obvious self-hating Jew. Having said that, when I debate him in Princeton, I mean, I'm walking around wearing a kippah. I was going to the Chabad afterwards to have a kosher dinner. I'm not going to say to Dave Smith, when's the last time you went to synagogue or lit Shabbat candles? I mean, that I'm going to lose the audience. That is not an effective line of debate. So, I mean, look, I mean, that's not exactly an apples to apples comparison to what Douglas did, but it's similar enough. Generally speaking, there expose the fallacy of the argument, but you don't necessarily want to go after the person as an individual for who he is.
Since let's continue with this before we go on to legal stuff. Look, I'm in the business of persuading people, right? And so when someone asks me, hey, why do you use sometimes humor or sarcasm, right? I mean, I wear a pink wig right? And someone will write to me and say, oh, but doesn't that affect your professorial, imprimatur? And I say, absolutely not. First of all, I'm a multifaceted creature. I can use multiple persuasion techniques depending on the audience. Humor is a very powerful tool, but it is perfectly fair to stop and think about when I'm delivering a message, what is the maximally optimal way for me to try to persuade my
Yes.
interlocutor? And the only very restricted point that I was making there is that precisely to your point when you said you might lose members of the audience, and I saw it when I looked at some of the comments, some people got turned off when Douglas came in there and did that. And I don't want to lose those people because his voice is too important,
Right.
and that's all it was. Okay, I think we've nailed this issue. Let's talk. Did your legal training in any way alter the trajectory or shape of how that this book was written? In other words, had you not been a lawyer, would there
Yeah.
have been different arguments that would have been made that are unique to you being a lawyer?
Yeah, great question. So I'm very passionate about the law. I'm very passionate about the United States Constitution above all. I've published numerous pieces of legal scholarship in constitutional law. I still speak at law schools actually to this day. So some of the earlier chapters of this book, Israel and Civilization, are actually heavy on the Anglo-American legal tradition, on the English common law, on the Constitution, and I'm able to talk about that with a certain degree of knowledge and authority. And, it's not just the law. I mean, to be clear, it is the law. So I'll give you just one example, Gad. So over the past couple of years, since the lawfare against now President Trump really commenced with Alvin Bragg in New York City back in the spring of 2023, we've heard this refrain from the left over and over and over again. They love to say, no one is above the law. Well, okay, I actually agree with that. I don't think the law means what they think it means. But here's the more interesting part. Where do you guys think this notion comes from? This notion that no one is above the law? It's literally from the book of Deuteronomy. That is from the Hebrew Bible. In fact, back in the in the late 14th, early 15th century, an old English common lawyer by the name of John Fortescue observed in one of his treatises that it was part of the common law of England that the king is not above the law. And he cited Deuteronomy. He literally cited the Bible for that proposition. So, I mean, all of that is in the book there, and I think I'm able to do so for sure to an extent due to my legal training. But there's also just basic things about our country, about the United States, that I think people today just seem to have forgotten there. So, I mean, something as prosaic as the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, this shining paean to American exceptionalism in our great country there. I mean, look on the outside of the Liberty Bell. I mean, to hear some people say it, you might think that it was a pagan source. No, it's literally the book of Leviticus. The Hebrew Bible is what is quoted there on the outside of the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Thou shalt proclaim liberty throughout the land. Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson both wanted the Great Seal of the United States to be Moses parting the Red Sea. I'll actually go even further than that. If you go back and look at the Pilgrims crossing the Atlantic Ocean on the Mayflower, believe it or not, they actually had conversations about potentially having a clean divorce, a severance of the English language, and then start speaking Hebrew when they got to the New
I think
World
I
in North
remember you.
America.
I remember you saying that on Ruben's show, and it surprised me. But go ahead.
No, it's really incredible, isn't it? I mean, when you look there, the captain of the Mayflower spoke over 1,000 words of Hebrew. Now, this never advanced beyond conversation. It was not seriously considered there, but this notion of philo-Semitism, and specifically of a form of Christianity that is deeply rooted in the Hebrew Bible. this really does kind of play a huge role in the founding of America, and that's definitely one of the arguments of my book there. But to kind of go back just briefly to my legal training there, I mean, when I remember a guy when I was a first year law student at the University of Chicago Law School, they basically throw you into the lion's den when it comes to learning the common law. You have the common law classes of contracts, torts, property, and you learn civil procedure, criminal procedure, and so forth there. But there's not really a big emphasis placed in legal education today, at least in the United States, when it comes to first establishing where the common law comes from. They kind of just throw it at you and say, okay, here are these guys in the old white wigs writing about the law back in these dusty chambers in the 1600s, but where's it coming from? Well, it's really coming from the Bible. I mean, these are mostly Christian men who are repeatedly citing Scripture, and in many cases, the Hebrew Bible, and frankly, in some cases, actually just the Talmud itself. I mean, there was one Englishman right in the 1600s, a man by the name of John Selden, a brilliant English conservative, kind of like a predecessor to Edmund Burke, really, about 150 years before Burke lived. John Selden was a devout Christian. They called him Rabbi Selden because he was a Talmudic expert. He was an expert in Talmudic law, and that kind of affected how he actually wrote about the English common law itself. So, I mean, this is all in the book, but yes, I mean, to an extent to your question, I think part of it really does get back to my legal training, and in many ways, I still think about the law basically every day of my life still.
I'm glad that you mentioned Talmudic law, and then I want to stick to the law from an evolutionary perspective. Maybe that will titillate your curiosity. So hopefully I'll remember to come back to that. But one of the things that's been pissing me off recently, whenever I post something on social media regarding, whatever, child brides or something, then there'll be a whole bunch of ridiculous Jew haters that usually it's almost always the same meme. It's sort of a bunch of quotes from various parts of the Talmud where it says something that's reprehensible. Or you can lay in bed with a 2-year old or whatever it is. I never know if it is true or not, or if it's taken out of context or not. Well, first of all, are you familiar with the types of memes I'm talking about? Have you
Of
seen?
course, of
Yes.
course.
Do you not think that it might be worthwhile for someone, it may not be you, you may not be the right Talmudic scholar, but to sort of, and of course, people will ignore it. The Jew haters will ignore the definitive rebuttal. But it seems like, so I don't know enough about that particular quote from a particular edict in the Talmud to say that it's BS or not. And therefore, since I have epistemic humility, I know what I know and I know what I don't know, then I won't traverse that minefield. But it seems to me that these types of memes are so prevalent that someone should take the time to just offer rebuttals to all of these. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. I've literally thought about this exact question before. So on the one hand, I have personally retweeted or reposted, whatever we're calling it these days, some threads that do exactly this. So
Ah, okay.
there's this one account. This guy lives in New York City. I honestly cannot remember his name. It's not a high volume account. I think he has maybe 3,000 followers or so, but he has done exactly this. He's an Orthodox Jew. He's learned in Talmud, and he tries to systematically debunk some of this. I'm oftentimes inclined to repost this. On the other hand, I get worried. I get worried about Jews feeling the need to defend the legitimacy of the Talmud. The Talmud is just our tradition says that the Talmud is just the oral Torah, is just the component of God's revelation to Moses at Mount Sinai that was not actually codified in the Torah. There was an oral component. And then the only reason that it gets written down is after the destruction of the Second Temple, when it became a literal necessity because the Jews were not living there in the land of Israel anymore there. So I get skittish about that. And traditionally, this has not always ended well, actually. So there was something called the Disputation of Paris. I believe was in the 13th century. The king of France was not a big fan of the Jews and essentially called for a grand debate between one of the Jews' representatives, one of the great Chachamim, one of the great rabbis there in France at that time, and a leading a Catholic theologian. And it was rigged, obviously, the debate. And surprise, surprise, the Jews lost. And as a result of that, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of Talmuds and various Jewish holy books that were just ceremoniously burned in the city streets there. So I get a little leery of this, looking at the history, but I hear you. It's something that I've thought about myself. I'm very much of two minds on. I'm a little torn on the question there, but there are some people out there that are doing this, but they're not necessarily the highest volume accounts. Ultimately, God, I'm skeptical that this would do a whole lot of good, to be honest with you, because I think a lot of people that are criticizing the Talmud there, they're not actually they don't care about what the Talmud says. They're just going for a very cheap shot against the Jews. The Talmud is basically a series of arguments. I mean, I've been doing Daf Yomi, which is the daily Talmud learning cycle for the past 5 years now. Literally every single page of Talmud are various rabbis very much disagreeing with each other, oftentimes in very heated and personal terms, actually, which is kind of humorous. There's a whole book, by the way, it's literally a whole book called Talmudic Insults. It's like the best insults from the Talmud there. Really, Judaism is not necessarily the
I
biggest.
must come from that tradition because
Yeah.
some of my insults are poetic on social media.
Right. So, Judaism, say what you will, it's not necessarily the biggest proponent of keeping discourse at all times civil. I mean, if you got to make your point in a heated fashion, then sometimes that is very much called for. But anyway, those are kind of my thoughts on the question there. I'm very much of a split mind on it, but I'm inclined towards thinking that it might do more harm than good, honestly.
Well, and I think so. Maybe some of my viewers and listeners might be tired of me repeating this example, but about a year ago, I was on a show hosted by a British psychiatrist, and toward the end of the show, he asked me a question that I think no one else has ever asked me, which is, of all the years that you've been, a behavioral scientist, a professor, what is the singular phenomenon that has most surprised you about the human condition? And so I paused for a second and said, probably the inability to change someone's mind once it is, solidly anchored in its position, which of course is it's a pessimistic outlook for someone who exists to hopefully try to change people's minds. Now, to the point of what we're talking about, I think that even if you offered refutations for each of those Talmudic things that the meme puts out, the person who is espousing that position is going to go la la la. I don't want to hear it. So to
Exactly.
your point, I don't. I mean, I would still like to have it in my back pocket so that I
Sure.
can pull it out if I need to,
Sure.
knowing full well that you probably are not going to listen to me because you're not an honest interlocutor. Okay, I promise to do evolutionary law. Before I even discuss what it is, can you at all surmise, and forgive me, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, how would you apply a Darwinian analysis to the law? Can you think of any way?
Well, I mean, first time I've been asked this own question, so I'm thinking through this in real time as your student, I suppose. I mean, Darwinian thought is survival of the fittest there. So you have competing legal codes, and you see which basically stands the test of time. That would be my best guess.
That's that well, and it's certainly a very good one. No, I mean, yes, that's great, but the term actually, at least the way I use it, and actually it's in this book right here, which was my first book ever. It was a academic book, so quite technical, titled "The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption." In chapter one, I do an evolutionary analysis of Hammurabi's code. The
Wow.
idea being that many of those edicts, since they stem from Darwinian beings, ultimately point to an evolutionary reality. For example, the I don't remember the exact quote in Hammurabi, but the man goes out to war and then he comes back and his wife is pregnant, whatever, where there is the possibility that there could have been paternity uncertainty. Well, paternity uncertainty is a very, very key driver of many sex differences between men and women, right? There is such a thing as paternity uncertainty. There is no such thing as maternity uncertainty. That's why men are much more unforgiving of cuckoldry than women. If a man cheats on a woman, it's only about a 30% chance that this ends the marriage. If a woman cheats on a man around cultures, it almost guarantees the dissolution of the marriage because it is triggering paternity uncertainty. And so evolutionary law is recognizing that fundamental features of legal codes are going to have a vestige of our evolutionary based human nature. What are your thoughts on that?
Fascinating. I didn't know that, by the way, about the competing percentages for divorce following from adultery versus from male or female. So that's genuinely interesting. It actually makes a whole lot of sense. Just kind of thinking it through as kind of just a common sense, just logical observation of human beings account there. Look, I mean, I think, I mean, to kind of connect the dots here, you probably see part of this in the Mosaic Law. I mean, frankly, in the Ten Commandments itself. I mean, the fifth commandment is honor your parents, honor your mother and your father. There. I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but to me, that seems about as evolutionary as it gets. I mean, these are literally the beings that gave you life. I mean, it naturally follows from a natural perspective, an evolutionary perspective there that you're going to want to honor those there. Hammurabi's code, of course, actually pre-existed the Ten Commandments. It was there hundreds of years prior to the Ten Commandments and was deeply influential in its own right there. So not something I've given a whole lot of thought to there. But I mean, this is not that different, frankly, than what I think a lot of legal theorists call natural law, which is this idea that the legal code, as enacted, so our positivist law or actual positive law, really ought to reflect that which is natural, that which is transcendental there. And Christianity, Judaism have slightly different approaches to this. What is the natural law and so forth there. But even in Judaism, we understand that there are some things in the legal code in the Bible or Talmud that are quote unquote reasonable or natural. We actually can distinguish between the commandments that are reasonable or extra reasonable. We call those mishpatim or chukim. There's a whole Talmudic debate actually about this, which is differentiating between the commandments such as honor your mother and father that are reasonable or those that might not seem as reasonable, such as the laws of kashrut, keeping kosher, and so forth there. So there is this idea of natural revolutionary law in the biblical religions, Christianity and Judaism alike there. And honestly, I haven't given a whole lot of thought to this, but it's definitely food for thought. I appreciate it.
I'll give you one more example, then we move on to the next topic. I'm very much enjoying my chat with you. In The Consuming Instinct, which was a trade book that I wrote for the masses, trying to explain evolutionary psychology in understanding human behavior. I have a couple of pages where I discuss, because I only thought of it now because you mentioned kashrut laws, kosher laws for our viewers who may not understand that term. And I actually argue that you can provide, now, of course, the rabbis don't like this idea because I'm offering a biological explanation for what is supposed to be a divine edict. So, for example, I argue that if you look at some of the prescriptions or edicts against eating certain types of shellfish foods and so on, right? I argue, well, imagine you are now in an environment in the Middle East where the shellfish, whether it is infected with a really deadly pathogen or not, you can't tell it, you can't smell it, you can't.
Mm,
There is no statistical regularity that would permit for cultural learning to be transmitted from one generation to the next. What happens? Mordechai eats it, he's perfectly fine. Moshe eats it, and he drops dead. Since we can't have any statistical rule to establish when you can eat it or not, suddenly we ascribe it to a godly thing. It makes perfect evolutionary sense. Now, again, I can understand how, from a theological perspective, people don't like this explanation because they like to ascribe it to God. But many of these food-related edicts, even in Islamic thing, could be explained as attempts to stop pathogenic infestation. Here's another one. Uh, Now, this I only know it from second source. John Durant, I think, wrote a book called The Paleo Manifesto many years ago, where he argued that out of the 613, codes, mitzvot, and so on, something like 20% of them are linked to purification rituals.
yeah.
And that itself explains the fact that in many pandemic, out realities, Jews had much lesser mortality rates because they were so obsessive about washing and so on, which then would cause the non-Jews to think that they are, part of the devil, because how come the rest of us are dropping dead while those asshole Jews are alive and thriving? And so I think there are a whole range of ways by which we could take some of the
Yeah.
stuff that I work in evolutionary theory and apply it to all sorts
Yeah.
of either legal or religious contexts.
This sounds like your next book. I would very much pre-order that book. That sounds fascinating. One thing on the purification rituals, it's probably important for the viewers to understand that when Judaism and Jewish law speaks of purity versus impurity, yes, part of it is what it sounds like in the modern connotation, keeping yourself clean. But a lot of it is actually more ritualistic than anything. So, for instance, a woman who is during her menstruation cycle is impure, but there's no moral stigma. There's nothing wrong about that. That's literally who we are as human beings. So yeah, part of it, I agree to an extent, is kind of actual hygiene and cleanliness. Part of it is really just more ritualistic. They're ultimately oriented towards trying to separate the profane from the holy, trying to achieve this maximal Jewish idea of collective holiness, which is really kind of the ultimate goal of the Jewish people and their being here on earth. The laws of kashrut are interesting as well. I guess here's my take on that. Let's remember that the laws of the Torah, all 613, were not meant to be universal. They were given to a specific people at a specific place in time. Now there is a concept of universality and universal laws in Jewish thought, but those are the seven laws of Noah, the seven Noahide laws, not the 613 commandments there. And if you look at the seven laws of Noah, which are these universal laws, which I argue in the book should be thought of as the moral minimum that countries around the world should abide by, we might think of that as the closest thing to universally binding natural law. So one of the seven laws there is that you shall not eat a live animal because it is repulsive, it is unholy, it is not fair, it's cruel to the animal, frankly. But the actual detailed laws of kashrut are not there in the Noahide laws. They're actually really just meant for the Jewish people. So to your point, I mean, maybe at the precise time when these laws were given thousands of years ago there, yeah, I mean, your example about Mordecai has the shellfish, he's fine, Moshe eats it, he drops dead. It genuinely might be for that reason, actually. I mean, I have no objection to that there whatsoever there. I mean, traditional Jewish thought would say the commandments are the commandments just because God said so. But I think it's totally fair to ask, why did he say so? We're not always going to know the answer, but sometimes we might.
Right. I know that I alluded earlier to the fact that you went from being more Reformed to Orthodox. Recently, we celebrated our son's bar mitzvah.
Mazel
And
tov.
thank you. Of course, well, of course, some people don't do it, but I put on tefillin, at the synagogue, and I actually posted that photo, which of course many people were very happy about. Other people were very upset about because that proved that I was this disgusting Jew and so on and so forth. But because I was talking about the trajectory of how you went, I actually put on tefillin for I think an 11-year period,
Wow.
uninterrupted, because of a rabbi that I had met at Cornell so I did my graduate training at Cornell, and there is a Chabad rabbi there who you know how those Chabad guys are. They bring in all the Jews and so on, but you know that there's going to be an ask at the end of the trajectory. And so one day I was sitting with him. We still remain very good friends 30 plus years later. As I was preparing to leave Ithaca, New York, having finished my PhD, he said, "God, you have a very Jewish soul." I said, "Oh, Rabbi, I feel like I'm in trouble. Something's coming my way." He goes, "You want to do me a favor?" I said, "Go ahead, Rabbi. What is it?" He said, "Would you put on tefillin? Would you promise me that you'll put on tefillin?" And I hadn't put on tefillin for many, many years since my bar mitzvah and so on. And this would have been, I'd be what, 29? I finished my PhD, something like that. And so for the next 11 or 12 years, uninterrupted, I honored that promise
Wow.
with that Rabbi Eli Silberstein. If you're listening to this, it was all due to you. But in any case, the funny ending of that story is that and I would take the tefillin anywhere I went and so on. I mean, really uninterrupted. And then there was a year when I was at Club Med with my wife, and it's so Club Med, if you don't know, is a all you can eat place where you pay a lot of money to eat all kinds of good food. And it so happened that Kippur happened during the time of the all you can eat feast, and it was my birthday. And I faced that Herculean bifurcation in the road where do I stay true to my promise, although I didn't promise to do it forever, Or do I now break it all? And unfortunately, Club Med broke me because I wasn't willing to do Kippur, not eat while I paid all this money and it's my birthday. And I think that sent me down the road of not putting on my tefillin. That was my story of how I sort of reverted back to putting on tefillin. Do you have a similar story of what led you from being wherever you were in your reform days to becoming a lot more practicing?
It's a great question. This is in the book to an extent as well. It did not happen overnight. I did not kind of have, I mean, to kind of mix metaphors here. I did not have a Saul on the way to Damascus style moment, right? I did not have a like a true kind of singular epiphany, but there were various moments over the years that very much put me in the direction that I am today. So the way that I describe it, Gad, in the book is a lot of people today, Jews and Christians alike, those who grew up in a more religious home, so Orthodox Jews, evangelical Christians, and so forth, they oftentimes will arrive at their political conclusions from their religion, which makes sense. I mean, if a religion is the most important thing to you, then you're going to view the civil world, the secular world, and so forth through that lens. I did basically the exact opposite. So I was always the token conservative, like literally going back to when I was in seventh grade. I was in seventh grade when 9/11 happened. I grew up on the Hudson River north of New York City. I could see the Twin Towers. That like so many of my generation, that was a big moment for me. And I realized that evil exists. And when you realize that evil exists, you necessarily also realize that good exists, because how could God create a world where there's only evil but not good? It doesn't make any sense. What will be the purpose of creation? And so once you understand that there is this real empirical and moral dichotomy between good and evil, you're basically a conservative before you know it, because you've already rejected the global utopianism of John Lennon's song Imagine and so forth, right? So I was basically a conservative at a very, very young age. And at some point, there were various moments where the Jewish element kicked in. So, for instance, my first time to Israel was actually on my Taglit birthright trip. I did it pretty late. I was I had 20 years old, I guess I was, during college. And I remember standing there in Sderot on the border between Gaza and Israel, looking out into Gaza. This is only a few years after Hamas took over. And it kind of just hit me. I was like, oh my God. I mean, I've been a defender for years. At that time, I was largely defending the Bush administration and their policies in Iraq and Afghanistan. My views on some of that have changed a little bit over the years. But regardless, it just clicked. I was like, oh my goodness. I mean, this is the same fight. This is literally the exact same fight. What Israel's doing, this is the exact same thing that I've been defending in high school and college and so forth for years now. But it was really only a few years after that I started getting deeper into the weeds of conservative political thought. I started reading people like Edmund Burke, maybe above all, people like Roger Scruton, and you start reading some of these great conservatives. And there's really one thing that stands out above all, which is this repeated emphasis on tradition, on this notion that nations, whether nations like the Jewish people or nations in the sense of America, Canada, Britain, nations only exist at a certain point because of this intergenerational compact, as Edmund Burke called it, between the dead, the living, and the yet unborn. So as I started getting kind of deeper into the weeds of conservative political philosophy, trying to buttress my own thinking on these matters there, at some point it kind of just occurs to you naturally, and you ask, well, this makes sense. So why am I not doing this? I mean, I come from the Jewish people. I come from the world's oldest continually existing people on the face of the earth today, the tiny nation that gave the world monotheism. So it was kind of that intellectual curiosity that led me to start going to more services and studying with a rabbi here or there. And it was a few years after that I first started laying tefillin on a daily basis. Kashrut came even after that. So, and then Shabbat even after that. So I mean, it really was not an overnight thing or anything like that. There, frankly, I still have a ways to go. My wife, my in-laws are Israeli. They speak fluent Hebrew. My Hebrew is terrible, so I really need to improve on that. So I've got a long ways to go, to be honest with you. But I would like to think that I'm on the right path.
Do you feel that so I've often compared proselytizing versus non-proselytizing, which let's say Islam would be the perfect manifestation of the former, Judaism would be the perfect manifestation of the latter. I've always said that when it comes to marketing, as a marketing problem, Islam is incredibly successful and Judaism is incredibly unsuccessful in that we're still at 15 million last I checked. Do you think that it would be valuable and I'm not pretending that you might know the answer to this, I mean, theologically, but I've always wondered whether we need to relax some of the entries to barrier to join the tribe, because I know that a lot of people who might otherwise be, interested in exploring Judaism, once they see that, it is baked into the religion to try to dissuade you. You shouldn't be, converting for ulterior motives and so on. Whereas let's say in Islam, you just say the Shahada, you proclaim it publicly, and voila, you are Muslim. Do you ever think about that, or do you view it from the other perspective, which is no, the sort of the chosen ones, and therefore that needs to remain pure, and therefore it makes sense for us to have great barriers to entry?
Uh, Yet another great question. You're very good at this. So I do veer towards the latter and not the former, but I will explain why. Uh, so first of all, we discussed earlier how there's this differentiation between the universal laws, the seven laws of Noah, and then these 613 particularist laws for the Jewish people. So the traditional kind of Jewish mentality is, if you are a non-Jew who is only bound by these seven laws, you want to take upon yourself the additional 606 basically to get to 613 there. I mean, bear in mind that you're taking on a tremendous burden there, right? So, I mean, that's kind of the traditional mentality as to why it would be initially dissuaded. Now, it should be noted, though, that Judaism does repeatedly, I mean, the Hebrew Bible repeatedly, over and over and over again, welcomes the convert. The translation typically in the Torah is proselytes, but it's referring to converts there over and over and over again. I mean, for instance, when the laws of the Sabbath are established there, you are to respect the seventh day and rest on the Sabbath, as will all in your family, all of your animals, your ox, your donkey, and the stranger and the proselyte. So it's the exact same rules there. In the Bible, we see that people come from converted lines. King David comes from a line where his ancestors were actually converts. The book of Ruth is a famous example, actually. My people will be your people, and my God will be your God, is the famous line from the book of Ruth. So, I mean, Judaism absolutely welcomes the convert, but it just wants people to make sure they understand exactly what they're signing up for. And ultimately, what they're signing up for, which kind of ties the circle here, what they're signing up for is what the book of Exodus in chapter 19 refers to as being a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. That really is, I'm really kind of mixing metaphors here, but what Aristotle would call the telos, like what is the actual overarching orientation of a legal order? That statement that I just said from Exodus, that's really the telos of the Jewish people. I mean, that's what we're called to do, is to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, trying to be a spark of divinity in this world. At least traditionally speaking, that is how Jewish thought understands the role of the Jewish people. So when you understand that there, I think there's something to be said for making sure the people who want to convert fully understand that what they're signing up for is what they're signing up for there. But I hear you loud and clear. And again, I've had this thought too. I actually have had this thought over the years. It's worth noting that the Orthodox conversion process obviously is quite stringent. More theologically liberal strands of Judaism aren't necessarily quite as stringent. We can debate whether or not that's a good and a bad thing there. But I think that Orthodox conversion is tough, but it's tough for a very compelling reason, I think.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. All right, I want to read the title of the book so that people can go out and get it. And I hopefully want us to end on a optimistic note, because it's very easy to go into the quicksand of pessimism. So the book is Israel and Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish People and the Destiny of the West. And I love the artwork on the cover. Really beautiful, very compelling. Can you give us some hope? Is there ever going to be peace in the Middle East? Are we going to find the vaccine against endemic, invariant, inerrant Jew hatred? Give us something to walk away and feel good about ourselves.
Okay, so I actually am an optimist by nature, believe it or not. I'm born on Abraham Lincoln's birthday, and Lincoln is my favorite figure in all of American history, and he is kind of the quintessential optimist in American history. Actually, Lincoln is in this book a little bit as well. So there's numerous reasons for optimism. But most concretely, we haven't talked a whole lot about the actual state of Israel itself there. I'm actually deeply optimistic about the state of Israel, the modern Zionism. To me, Israel is actually geostrategically is in one of the best places, if not the best place that it has been since the state was formed in 1948. For many, many decades, Israel had existential enemies on all sides trying to kill it. Where it was Egypt, it was Jordan, it was Syria, it was the Saudis and the various others in the Arabian Peninsula. There, at this point, Israel essentially has one existential enemy, which is the Iranian regime. Now, Turkey could become there. I don't want to whitewash Turkey. Recep Tayyip Erdogan's Turkey could become that. And Israel's watching that situation in Syria like a hawk right now, given the Erdogan influence in Damascus. But right now, it really is the proverbial head of a snake, which is the Iranian regime in Tehran and its various proxies. That is Israel's one major issue. And that's, on the one hand, that's scary because Iran's a very scary country. They've demonstrated that repeatedly, but it's also kind of reassuring that there's only one threat. And that point, I think, is only buttressed by looking at various signs for optimism within Israeli society itself. Israel has by far the highest birth rates of any Western-style country, by far. And by the way, that's not just religious Jews. Even secular Israelis have a birth rate that is considerably higher than European countries, North American countries, Australia, New Zealand, you name it there. And the reason for that is because Israel is a very happy country. The people are very happy there. It consistently ranks as one of the happiest countries in the world there. Yes, it's frenetic. Yes, it's chaotic. As anyone who's ever visited has gotten this sense there. It can be a little stressful when it comes to parking and checking out the supermarket before Shabbat there. But the country overall is in really, really, really good shape. And that to me is a very, 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 very compelling sign of optimism.
From your lips to God's ear. What a pleasure it is to meet you, Josh. Thank you so much for coming on. Come back anytime that you feel like it. And I'm really glad that we've connected. Thank you so much.
Oh, the pleasure is mine. Thank you so much.
Cheers.